The quest for the immortal body begins not in the laboratory, but in the chasm of existential awareness, that terrible moment when consciousness recognizes its own mortality and recoils. This is not the naive fear of death that haunts the unreflective mind, but rather a sophisticated terror, the recognition that the self, in all its accumulated wisdom and hard-won insights, faces absolute annihilation. The alchemist stands before this abyss and makes a peculiar choice, not to accept dissolution, not to seek comfort in religious promises, but to undertake the audacious project of transformation itself. The historical emergence of alchemical practice in Hellenistic Alexandria, medieval Europe, and imperial China reveals a consistent pattern. These traditions arose in periods of cultural synthesis, when philosophical systems collided and individuals could no longer rely on inherited frameworks of meaning. The alchemist is born from this crisis of certainty. When the gods no longer guarantee continuity, when the soul's immortality becomes a question rather than an article of faith, the human being must become both the question and the answer, both the base metal and the gold. This initial spark is fundamentally psychological. It represents what depth psychology would later identify as the individuation impulse, the drive toward wholeness that emerges when the ego recognizes its own incompleteness. The alchemist's obsession with transmutation is, at its core, an obsession with self-overcoming. The promise of the philosopher's stone, that miraculous substance capable of transmuting lead into gold and conferring immortality, serves as a compelling symbol for the integrated self, the personality that has transmuted its own base drives and fragmented aspects into a coherent, resilient whole. Yet we must remain skeptical of literalism. The historical record shows numerous frauds, charlatans and self-deceived practitioners who pursued physical gold and bodily immortality through increasingly desperate experiments. The authentic alchemical tradition, however, always contained a parallel stream of symbolic interpretation, the understanding that the laboratory work served as a concrete meditation on interior transformation. The immortal body is not flesh that defies decay, but a psychological structure capable of facing dissolution without disintegration, a consciousness that has learned to die and be reborn within the confines of a single lifetime. The architecture of alchemical philosophy rests upon a foundational paradox: unity achieved through division, permanence through transformation, life through death. This is not a simple dialectic, but a complex system that mirrors the psychological processes by which the self achieves coherence through the integration of opposites. The central doctrine can be summarized in the axiom, solve et coagula, dissolve and coagulate. All that is rigid must be liquefied, all that is chaotic must be given form. The oscillation between these poles constitutes the very rhythm of transformation. The alchemical worldview posits a continuity between matter and spirit, between the external world and the internal psyche. This is not primitive animism, but a sophisticated recognition that the same organizing principles operate across different domains of existence. The alchemist observes that metals grow in the earth over vast periods, that substances combine and separate according to their inherent natures, and extrapolates a cosmos governed by affinity, sympathy, and correspondence. Every material process becomes a mirror for a psychological one. Every chemical operation reflects a drama of consciousness. The concept of the prima materia, the first matter, serves as the philosophical foundation. This is the original, undifferentiated substance from which all things emerge and to which all things return. In psychological terms, this represents the unconscious itself in its totality, that vast, undifferentiated realm of potential from which the conscious ego crystallizes. The alchemical work begins with the recognition and recovery of this prima materia within oneself. It is the return to the original chaos, the deliberate dissolution of the carefully constructed persona, the voluntary descent into confusion and uncertainty. The doctrine of the four elements, earth, water, air, and fire, provides the operational framework. These are not literal substances, but qualities of experience and modes of being. Earth represents stability, materiality, and the body's wisdom. Water signifies emotion, fluidity, and the capacity for dissolution. Air embodies intellect, communication, and the realm of ideas. Fire symbolizes transformation, will, and the catalytic force that drives change. The alchemist must learn to work with all four elements, recognizing when to stabilize, earth, when to feel and flow, water, when to think and discriminate, air, and when to transform through intensity, fire. The supreme goal of this philosophical architecture is the creation of the philosopher's stone, or the achievement of the magnum opus, the great work. This represents the culmination of the transformative process, the emergence of an integrated self that has successfully united all opposites, masculine and feminine, the chemical wedding of soul and lunar, spirit and matter, the conjunction of sulfur and mercury, consciousness and unconsciousness, the union of above and below. The stone is incorruptible because it has incorporated corruption. It is immortal because it has died to mortality. It is all-powerful because it has surrendered the illusion of power. Central to this doctrine is the principle of correspondence. As above, so below. As within, so without. This is not mystical hand-waving, but a recognition that the structures of consciousness recapitulate the structures of the cosmos, and vice versa. The alchemist who works on metals in the laboratory is simultaneously working on the metals, the qualities and energies within their own psyche. The furnace, the alembic, the crucible, all become instruments of self-knowledge. The heat applied to the substance mirrors the intensity of attention applied to one's own psychological contents. The doctrine also emphasizes the necessity of the opus contra naturam, the work against nature. This does not mean a violation of natural law, but rather an intervention in the automatic processes of psychic life. Left to itself, consciousness fragments, repeats patterns, calcifies into rigidity, or dissolves into chaos. The alchemist's work is to guide these natural tendencies toward a higher synthesis, to accelerate and direct what would otherwise occur slowly or not at all. This requires what the tradition calls the secret fire, not physical heat, but the focused intensity of awareness itself, the capacity to remain present with discomfort, to observe without fleeing, to contain without repressing. Finally, the architecture includes the concept of regeneration through putrefaction, the Nigredo, or blackening. Before anything new can emerge, the old must fully decay. This is perhaps the most difficult teaching for the modern mind to accept, that genuine transformation requires not improvement, but decomposition, not the enhancement of what already exists, but its thorough dissolution. The alchemist must be willing to become the putrefying matter, to experience the death of their current identity, to pass through the stage where all meaning collapses and all previous certainties reveal themselves as constructions. The alchemical journey unfolds through a series of well-defined stages, each representing a specific psychological challenge and transformation. While different texts enumerate these stages differently, a consistent core sequence emerges across traditions. The Nigredo, blackening, Albedo, whitening, Citrinitas, yellowing, and Rubedo, reddening. These are not merely abstract categories, but descriptions of actual lived experience in the process of profound psychological transformation. The Nigredo, confrontation with shadow. The journey begins with the Nigredo, often symbolized by the black crow, the tomb, or the skull, images of death, decay, and dissolution. This is the stage of mortificatio, the death of the old self. Psychologically, it corresponds to the encounter with what Jung termed the shadow, all those aspects of ourselves we have denied, repressed, or projected onto others. The Nigredo is characterized by depression, confusion, and a sense of meaninglessness. The carefully constructed identity begins to crack. The achievements and roles that once provided definition now feel hollow. In this stage, the practitioner must resist two temptations: premature escape and false resolution. The modern mind, trained in positivity and progress, seeks to quickly exit discomfort. But the alchemical tradition insists that the Nigredo cannot be bypassed, it must be fully experienced. This requires what the tradition calls patience, but which we might better understand as radical acceptance, the capacity to remain present with psychological material that the ego finds intolerable. The individual must learn to observe their own dissolution without intervention, to become both the decomposing matter and the witness of decomposition. The work of the Nigredo involves calcinatio, the burning away of excess, the reduction to ash. Every attachment, every identity, every belief must be subjected to the fire of scrutiny. What survives this burning is essential. What burns away was merely ornamental. This is profoundly uncomfortable because most of what we call self is precisely these ornamental additions, the social roles, the cultural conditioning, the defensive strategies developed in childhood. The Nigredo reveals the persona as construction, exposing the naked vulnerability beneath. The Albedo, purification and reflection. From the blackness of putrefaction emerges the albedo, the whitening. This stage is associated with washing, purification, and the separation of the subtle from the gross. If the Nigredo was descent and dissolution, the albedo is clarification and discrimination. The psychological correlate is the development of witness consciousness, the capacity to observe one's own mental processes without identification. The albedo represents the achievement of a certain detachment, a cooling after the heat of the Nigredo. Symbolically, the albedo is represented by the white dove, the moon, and the figure of the white queen. This is traditionally associated with the feminine principle, receptivity, reflection, and the capacity to hold without possessing. In psychological terms, it represents the development of the anima in men, or a deeper relationship with the feminine aspect of psyche in women. The albedo teaches the virtue of receptivity, the understanding that transformation cannot be forced, but must be allowed to unfold according to its own inherent logic. The danger of the albedo is premature identification with purity or enlightenment. The practitioner who reaches this stage may mistake clarity for completion, detachment for wisdom. The white stage can become a refuge from the messiness of embodied existence, a spiritual bypassing that uses transcendence to avoid integration. The authentic albedo, however, is not an endpoint but a necessary stage of purification that prepares the ground for the next phase of work. It is the washing that makes the matter receptive to further transformation. In this stage, the alchemist practices sublimatio, the elevation of the volatile, the refinement of the gross into the subtle. This involves taking the raw, emotional, and instinctual energies revealed in the Nigredo and submitting them to reflection and analysis. Dreams become important, as does any practice that cultivates the observing consciousness, meditation, journaling, therapy. The goal is not to eliminate the contents of the unconscious, but to establish a conscious relationship with them, to transform the autonomous complex into the integrated function. The Citrinitas, the dawn of individual authority. The Citrinitas, or yellowing, is sometimes absorbed into other stages in abbreviated alchemical schemas, but its psychological importance deserves separate consideration. This is the stage symbolized by the rising sun, the peacock's tail with its display of iridescent colors, and the beginning of illumination. If the albedo represented the moon's cool reflection, the Citrinitas represents the first rays of the sun, the emergence of individual insight and personal authority. Psychologically, the Citrinitas corresponds to the integration of the animus, in women, or a deeper relationship with the masculine aspect of psyche, in men. This is the development of discernment, judgment, and the capacity to act decisively based on one's own understanding rather than external authority. The practitioner who has passed through the Nigredo's dissolution and the albedo's purification now begins to formulate their own principles, their own philosophy of life, derived from direct experience rather than received doctrine. The Citrinitas involves the alchemical operation of separatio, the careful discrimination between what is essential and what is superfluous, between genuine insight and self-deception. This requires a sharpening of intellectual faculties, but an intellect now informed by the emotional depth of the Nigredo and the reflective capacity of the albedo. It is reason tempered by experience, logic illuminated by intuition. The danger here is premature inflation, the identification with wisdom before wisdom has fully matured, The assumption of authority before authority has been earned through the completion of the work. The Rubedo, the embodiment of wholeness. The final stage is the Rubedo, the reddening, symbolized by the red king, the phoenix, and the sunrise. This represents the completion of the great work, the emergence of the integrated personality, the achievement of the philosopher's stone. The Rubedo is characterized by embodiment, vitality, and the capacity for creative action in the world. If the earlier stages involved withdrawal and internal work, the Rubedo represents the return to life with transformed understanding and capacity. The Rubedo is achieved through conjunctio, the sacred marriage of opposites. All that has been separated must now be reunited, spirit and matter, consciousness and unconscious, masculine and feminine, above and below. But this is not a return to the original unconscious unity. It is a higher synthesis that maintains the discriminations achieved in the earlier stages while transcending them. The individual who achieves the Rubedo has integrated their shadow, Nigredo, developed witness consciousness, Albedo, and claimed personal authority, Citrinitas. Now these achievements are unified in a personality capable of responding creatively to life's challenges. The Rubedo is associated with the alchemical operation of multiplicatio, the multiplication of the stone's power. Psychologically, this represents the capacity of the integrated personality to influence others not through domination, but through presence. The individual who has completed the great work radiates a certain quality that others instinctively recognize, not perfection, but authenticity. Not invulnerability, but genuine wholeness that includes vulnerability. This is the immortal body, not flesh that lives forever, but a psychological structure that has incorporated death and thereby transcended the terror of death. Yet we must remain skeptical of triumphalism. The completion of the Rubedo is not the end of psychological work, but the achievement of a stable platform from which genuine living can begin. The alchemical journey is not linear but spiral. The practitioner may cycle through these stages multiple times at different levels of depth. Each return to the Nigredo reveals new layers of shadow. Each Albedo achieves a deeper purification. Each Citrinitas claims a more authentic authority. Each Rubedo embodies a more complete wholeness. At the heart of the alchemical journey lies an inevitable crisis, a moment when the entire project seems futile, when the dissolution achieved feels irreversible, when the promise of gold reveals itself as delusion. This is not simply the Nigredo's darkness, but a more profound despair, the recognition that transformation itself might be impossible, that the self might be fundamentally incapable of the integration it seeks. Every authentic spiritual journey encounters this crisis, and the alchemical tradition names it explicitly, the stage where the practitioner confronts the possibility that they are working with flawed material, that the prima materia of their own psyche is irredeemably corrupt. This crisis typically emerges at the transition between dissolution and reconstitution, after the Nigredo has done its work of breaking down the old structures, but before the Albedo's clarity has fully emerged. The practitioner finds themselves suspended in a liminal space where the old self has died, but the new self has not yet been born. This is the psychological equivalent of the alchemical stage known as putrefactio, the complete rotting of the matter. It is characterized by a profound sense of stagnation, of being trapped in decay without any movement toward regeneration. The existential dimension of this crisis cannot be overstated. The practitioner has voluntarily dismantled the defenses and illusions that made ordinary life bearable. They have seen through the persona, recognized the shadow, acknowledged the ways they have lived inauthentically. But this seeing through does not automatically produce new meaning or purpose. Instead, it creates a vacuum, a terrifying openness where certainty used to reside. The questions become acute. What if there is no true self beneath the false selves? What if the integration sought is merely another construction, another delusion? What if the alchemical promise is itself a defense against the fundamental groundlessness of existence? This crisis often manifests as what spiritual traditions call the dark night of the soul, but which we might more accurately describe as the confrontation with meaninglessness. The practitioner who has devoted years to the work suddenly sees it as absurd, alchemical symbols as mere fantasy, psychological insight as elaborate rationalization, the entire transformative project as a sophisticated form of escape from the simple truth of mortality and limitation. This is not depression in the clinical sense, though it may include depressive symptoms. It is rather a shattering of the fundamental structures through which meaning is constructed. The temptation at this stage is regression, the desperate attempt to reconstruct the old identity, to return to the comfort of unreflective life, to abandon the journey and settle for ordinariness. Many practitioners do exactly this, and the alchemical literature is filled with warnings about those who lose the work at this critical juncture. The regression is so seductive because it offers immediate relief from the unbearable tension of the liminal state. But regression is ultimately impossible. Once consciousness has expanded, it cannot genuinely contract. The attempt to return produces only inauthenticity, a hollow mimicry of the unreflective life that once came naturally. The other temptation is spiritual inflation. The premature claim to have completed the work, the identification with enlightenment or perfection as a defense against the despair of incompleteness. This is perhaps more dangerous than regression because it masquerades as success. The inflated practitioner develops a spiritual persona, speaks confidently of transformation and wisdom, and may even teach others. But beneath the facade lies the unintegrated shadow, the unresolved crisis, the refused descent. The inflation eventually collapses, often catastrophically, because it is built on denial rather than genuine integration. The authentic response to this crisis is surrender, not resignation but a deeper letting go. The practitioner must abandon even the attachment to transformation itself, must be willing to remain in the crucible without knowing if anything will emerge. This is the alchemical operation of solutio, complete dissolution in the universal solvent. It requires what the tradition calls faith, but not faith in any external guarantor or theological doctrine. Rather, it is faith in the process itself, a trust that if one can remain present with the dissolution, if one can resist both regression and inflation, something genuine will emerge, not because it is promised or deserved, but because this is the nature of psyche itself. The crisis is resolved not through effort, but through endurance, the simple willingness to remain conscious while the transformation occurs at a level beyond conscious control. The practitioner learns that they are not the agent of their own transformation, but its witness and its vessel. The ego, which began the journey with the heroic ambition to remake itself, discovers its proper role, to maintain consciousness and provide stable conditions while the deeper self does the actual work of integration. This discovery is simultaneously humbling and liberating. Humbling because it reveals the ego's ultimate impotence in the face of the psyche's autonomous processes. Liberating because it releases the ego from the impossible burden of controlling its own transformation. The emergence from the crisis marks the beginning of genuine integration, not a sudden enlightenment, but a gradual stabilization of a new psychological structure. The immortal body that results is not characterized by invulnerability or perfection, but by a specific quality, resilience through flexibility. The integrated personality can bend without breaking, can face dissolution without disintegration, can die and be reborn repeatedly within the course of a single lifetime. This is the true meaning of alchemical immortality, not the body's persistence, but consciousness's capacity for continuous regeneration. The new self bears specific characteristics that distinguish it from the pre-alchemical personality. First, there is a fundamental shift in the locus of identity, where the ego previously identified with its contents, thoughts, emotions, roles, achievements, the integrated self identifies with the process of consciousness itself. This creates a stable center that can observe the flux of experience without being swept away by it. The individual becomes less reactive, not because they suppress emotion, but because they no longer mistake any particular emotional state for the totality of who they are. Second, the integrated personality demonstrates paradox tolerance, the capacity to hold contradictory truths simultaneously without collapsing into either-or thinking. This is the psychological fruit of the alchemical axiom, unity through opposition. The individual can be both strong and vulnerable, certain and uncertain, engaged with life and detached from outcomes. They can act decisively while remaining open to being wrong, can commit deeply while holding their commitments lightly. This is not inconsistency, but a higher-order coherence that transcends simple logical consistency. Third, there is a marked increase in creative capacity, not necessarily in artistic production, but in the ability to respond freshly to situations, to generate novel solutions, to live originally rather than repetitively. This creativity flows from the integration of conscious and unconscious processes. Where previously the unconscious erupted chaotically or remained locked away, now there is a fluid exchange between conscious intention and unconscious wisdom. The integrated individual has access to depths of intuition and insight that were previously unavailable. Fourth, the immortal body manifests as authentic presence, a quality of being fully present in each moment that others instinctively recognize and respond to. This is not performance or charisma in the conventional sense, but something more subtle, the absence of self-consciousness, the lack of internal fragmentation. When the integrated person speaks, there is a sense that the whole person is speaking, that nothing is held back or defended against. This presence is magnetic, not because it seeks attention, but because it represents what others unconsciously long for, the possibility of genuine wholeness. The integration is not complete in the sense of finished, but in the sense of functional. All parts of the psyche now cooperate rather than conflict. The shadow is acknowledged and integrated rather than projected. The anima or animus is related to consciously rather than acted out unconsciously. The personal and collective unconscious are accessed deliberately rather than erupting autonomously. This does not eliminate suffering or struggle, but it transforms their quality. The integrated person suffers consciously rather than blindly, struggles purposefully rather than repetitively. The result of the great work is ultimately pragmatic. It is measured not in mystical experiences or theoretical understanding, but in the capacity to live well in the fullest sense. The alchemist who completes the work does not transcend the human condition, but inhabits it fully, embraces its limitations without despair, engages its possibilities without inflation. They have discovered that the immortal body was never about escaping death, but about learning to die consciously, to release each moment as it passes, to let each version of self dissolve as life demands, to be continually reborn into the present without clinging to the past or fleeing toward the future. The laboratory was always a mirror, the metals always metaphors, the furnace always the heart's own fire, and the gold you seek lies not in the crucible's bottom, but in the unwavering gaze that watches the transformation without flinching. For the philosopher's stone is consciousness itself, perfected through its willingness to dissolve and coagulate again and again until the distinction between seeker and sought vanishes in the radical simplicity of awareness aware of itself.